If you remember how we used to have the lessons before we had PowerPoints, that's what we're going to have tonight. I did have a PowerPoint for this lesson, but I misplaced it. When I got here, I didn't have it. So we're going to do it as we used to do it. And I think we can do that fine and get just as much out of it. Our lesson that I want to study tonight is called Two Men Named Lazarus. And I want to read a little bit of John chapter 11, which will introduce one of those men. And then we'll be talking about his life later. Reading from the New King James in John 11, it says, "Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. It was that Mary, who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. When Jesus heard that, he said, this sickness is not to, verse 3, therefore the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. When Jesus heard that, he said, this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it." And we'll stop there. The name Lazarus means God is help, or God has helped. And there are two men in the New Testament that have that name. And God helped both of them in different ways, but he helped both of them. The record of these two men kind of provides a contrast. Their circumstances were completely different as far as this world is concerned. But they had similarities also. And their similarity, main and most important similarity, was their relationship to God. I hadn't thought much about this until I started working on this lesson. And we don't have a single word recorded from either one of these men. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. But there's quite a bit said about them and said on their behalf, but not a single word. And yet their lives provide lessons for us that are important, and lessons that we need to remember. We need to learn and we need to remember. So let's look first of all at this Lazarus that is mentioned in John chapter 11. And he was a man of some wealth and influence. And you might say, well, how do you know that? Well, after he died, many of the Jews came from Jerusalem to Bethany to comfort his sisters. And that suggests a little bit, I think, of his character, that he had a good character, and also that he was a prominent person. And the fact that he was host to Jesus further suggests that he was a man of some wealth. And he lived in Bethany. And Bethany was a town on the Mount of Olives, not too far from Jerusalem. And he lived with his sisters, who were Mary and Martha. And Jesus visited their home from time to time. One of those visits is recorded in Luke chapter 10 and verse 38. And this is when Jesus was teaching, and you remember that Martha was busy getting everything ready, and Mary sat at Jesus' feet and heard him teach, and he commended her for her interest and that said she had chosen the most important thing, and it wouldn't be taken away from her. Now, Lazarus isn't mentioned in Luke chapter 10, verse 38 there, but they were his sisters, and he went into their house. He may not have been there on that occasion, but that was his home that Jesus visited. The writer tells us that later Mary, Lazarus' sister, anointed Jesus' feet. And we know that was just before his crucifixion. when his friends prepared a supper for him, and in the house of Simon the leper. And Mark 14:3 tells us that. Jesus called him our friend Lazarus. And think about that. The great honor of being Jesus' friend and being acknowledged as Jesus' friend. And all who obey Jesus today are his friends. If we obey Jesus, he considers us his friends. He told his disciples in John 15 and verse 14, "You are my friends if you do whatever I command you." You are my friends. Lazarus was one of Jesus' closest friends. And we see in verse 3 that his sister said that Jesus loved Lazarus. There are two times that word is used here. And in this case, the word is philean, which is a love of friendship, a love of appreciation and affection. And John said in verse 5, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. The word there is a different word for love, and it's a form of agape, which we are familiar with. It's used most of the time for love in the New Testament. But we know that agape love is an unselfish love and a love that seeks what is best for the object of that love. And that's the type of love that Jesus had for Lazarus. He has that love for his people today. All of these things suggest to me that Lazarus was a righteous man. He was a good man. And he was the subject of one of Jesus's greatest miracles. And all of us, I think, are aware of that. And Lazarus became sick, and sickness and death come to every family. If you're young, you may not have experienced that yet, but it will come to every family at some point. The Hebrew writer says in Hebrews 9 and verse 27, and as it is appointed for men to die once, and after this the judgment. So Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many. So indeed, at some point, we'll be sick, or we'll have relatives that are sick, or that pass from this earth. Lazarus became seriously ill. And if we read on through the chapter here, we'll find that his sisters could have sent to Jerusalem for a doctor. It wasn't all that far. But the first thought they had was to tell Jesus about it, to send word to Jesus. And they did just that. They sent a message to Jesus telling him about Lazarus' sickness. And they didn't ask him to come, but that was the implication. That was the clear implication. Come and help him, heal him. But Jesus didn't do that. Jesus was about 30 miles away, most commentators think, in the area of Perea, which was on the other side of the Jordan River from Bethany. And he delayed 4 days before he came to Mary, Martha, there in Bethany. We know that he restored life to Lazarus with just 3 words. Lazarus, come forth. And at least one commentator has said that if he didn't speak his name, all in the graves there would have come forth. And that's what's going to happen later in the future. Jesus is going to call all the dead to come forth and the resurrection of the dead. But on this occasion, he raised Lazarus. Why did Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead? Well, we're told. He says this sickness is not unto death, not a death that's going to continue, but for the glory of God and the Son of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. That's 11 verse 4. And he didn't raise Lazarus to give him a second chance. Jesus never raised any of those that he raised from the dead to give them a second chance, to get their lives in order. And we'll notice more about that later. But think about if Lazarus hadn't been a good man, and Jesus raised him from the dead. What do you suppose his critics would have said? Not that he's just a friend of sinners, but he gives sinners more time. He favors sinners in that regard. And it would have made Jesus look bad, really, if he had raised a wicked man. So we can conclude from all the evidence that Lazarus was a righteous man, as we've said. And Lazarus became a living testimony to the power and the deity of Jesus. If those that didn't see him after he rose from the dead heard the story. And it caused a lot of the Jewish leaders to consider what they were going to do about it. And they decided that they wanted to kill Lazarus as well as Jesus. And at that supper that they prepared for him in Bethany, right before he was arrested and crucified, John 12 and verse 9 tells us, now a great many of the Jews knew that he was there. I think they're talking about Jesus there. And they came not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might also see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. But the chief priests plotted to put Lazarus to death also, because on account of him, many of the Jews went away and believed in Jesus. His resurrection was the evidence that persuaded some of the Jews to believe Jesus was the Son of God, that he said he was. And they wanted to get rid of the evidence if they could. Now, this is the last that we read about Lazarus in the New Testament, Lazarus of Bethany in the New Testament. And I want to look at the other Lazarus for just a little bit. This Lazarus is mentioned in Luke 16. And it's a very brief account from verses 19 to verse 26. This Lazarus was a beggar. And some say that this is a parable. And I was reading a commentator before I came this afternoon that seemed to think it's a parable of Jesus. But Jesus didn't call it a parable. Now, it does have symbolic language. It talks about Abraham's bosom, which is symbolic. But Jesus didn't use names in his parables, typically. But he mentions Lazarus here. So you can decide what you think about that, but whether it is a parable or whether it's an actual story or an account, the truths are the same. The truth doesn't change, whether it's a parable or not, the things taught in this story. Jesus used this beggar to teach about the danger of covetousness. You know, the Pharisees, right before this, Jesus had taught the parable of what is usually called the unjust or the unrighteous servant. The servant who misused his master's goods. And the Pharisees made fun of him for that. They derided him. And they did that because they were covetous. In Luke 16:14, it says, now the Pharisees were lovers of money. Now the Pharisees who were lovers of money heard all these things and they derided him. You know, the Pharisees had a perverted concept of wealth and poverty. They thought that wealth was a sign of divine favor and approval, and that poverty was a curse for sin. If you were poor, it was because you were wicked. If you were rich, it was because God liked you. God looked on you as being good and righteous. Now, Jesus showed their folly in this story. He showed how foolish that conclusion was. And we live in a prosperous land in prosperous times. And we need to learn the lesson that he taught here in this story. We know very little about this Lazarus. We don't get much information about him. We don't know anything about his family, as we did with Lazarus of Bethany. We don't know how he became a beggar. I doubt that he was a beggar all his life, but in his latter years, he was a beggar. It appears that he was crippled. And you say, why is that? Because he was placed at the rich man's gate. He didn't walk up there. So that suggests to me he couldn't make his way there by himself. And he was sick and full of sores. Think about that. Terrible condition. Terrible condition. Not only was he having to beg, but he was sick, full of sores. He was dependent on others for his survival. And his only companions, we read, were the dogs who came and licked his sores. They gave him some relief, I guess, from the pain that he had, being covered with sores. We know the story, that he was put at the rich man's gate because the rich man had the resources to help him. But there could be no doubt, and his gate was very close, and the rich man went in and out of his house. There could be no doubt in the mind of anyone who saw this man that he was in dire need of help. He needed some help. And, you know, sometimes we encounter people that have their hand out or have signs saying various things that they need help. Some of them are just trying to get money. We call them panhandlers today. And sometimes there's a question in our minds, is this person really in need or not? Or is he just lazy and using this as a way to get money? And some of them are today. We've heard stories about that. But no doubt about Lazarus. No doubt he was not a person looking out to get more money. Matter of fact, the writer tells us that he only wanted the rich man's crumbs. He wanted the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. And he only wanted enough to survive. But the sad truth is he didn't receive even those. There's no record that he received even the scraps of the rich man's meals. And the rich man could have done much more than that for him. The story goes on that the Lazarus and the rich man died. Jesus tells us that they went to different places. And in those places, their condition was reversed. They were in a place called Hades. And Hades in the scriptures is the place where the spirits of people go after death and before the resurrection. And in that place, they were in two different parts of Hades. The rich man suffered in a place of torment. The only reason for this rich man suffering that is in the record is that he didn't help Lazarus. He didn't give Lazarus even the crumbs from his table. Now, he was guilty of other sins, I'm confident. I'm satisfied. But they're not mentioned here. What's emphasized is he didn't help this man who was in serious need. There's a beautiful description of Lazarus' death here. It said that he was carried by angels to a place of comfort and rest called Abraham's bosom. You know, God helped Lazarus of Bethany in different ways. He gave him two sisters that loved him. He gave him Jesus as a friend, and he gave him more time on this earth by having Jesus raise him from the dead. God helped Lazarus by giving him an escort to a place of comfort called Abraham's bosom. And Abraham's bosom here is what is the place that Jesus called paradise in Luke chapter 23. You remember when Jesus was on the cross and one of the thieves crucified with him asked Jesus to remember him when he came into his kingdom? And that's an amazing thing right there. But one of the thieves asked for Jesus to remember him. And Jesus said, "This day you'll be with me in paradise." So that's where Jesus went, and that's where the penitent thief went after Jesus' death on the cross. Now, the beggar wasn't in Abraham's bosom because he was poor. There are a lot of wicked poor people. We know that. And they're not, if they don't change their ways, they're not going to be in a place of comfort when they leave this life. They're going to be where the rich man was. But he was there because he lived a righteous life. And in the last part of his life, he had to deal with sickness. He had to deal with pain. He had to deal with hunger. Some of you may know the commentator McGarvey, J.W. McGarvey, who was a scholar and a commentator on the scriptures. And in his fourfold gospel, he said that Lazarus had a stewardship of suffering, and he said he was faithful in it. He faithfully bore it. We don't read of any resentment of Lazarus, don't read of any complaint or speaking evil of the rich man who wouldn't help him. He just suffered. He bore it. And the Lord delivered him from it. Notice some lessons that we can learn from these two men named Lazarus. The first lesson I would suggest is God's judgment is different from man's. People looking at these two men would have thought, boy, Lazarus of Bethany is a great guy, and this beggar must be a bad guy. He must be. But God loved them both. And he judges based on our heart, not on our outward appearance. And in Luke 16 and 15, in this chapter that has the story of the beggar in it, he said to them, you are those who justify yourselves before men, speaking to the Jewish leaders. You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. For what is highly esteemed among men is an abomination in the sight of God. God knew the hearts of the beggar and the hearts of the rich man, and he knew the heart of Lazarus of Bethany. And he knew what their desires were and what they wanted to do. Another lesson we can learn is too strong a desire for wealth is dangerous. One can have too much of a desire to be wealthy. And if that's the case, it can cause a person to be stingy and refuse to help those who are really in need. Or it can cause the person to spend too much time pursuing more wealth and not enough time laying up treasure in heaven or serving the Lord. Another lesson is God will accept the poorest people. There's no monetary requirement for being a Christian, for serving the Lord today. James said in James 2 and 5, speaking of those who were rich and took advantage of poor Christians, he said, listen, my beloved brethren, has God not chosen the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he promised to those who love him? We read in the scriptures about some rich people who were righteous, like Abraham and others in the scriptures. But in many cases, wealth is a stumbling block to people in following Christ. And of course, a lesson that's very obvious, we've got to be merciful to those who are truly in need. Jesus said in Matthew 5 and 7, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. And in that judgment scene in Matthew 25, those who were accepted by Jesus and welcomed into fellowship with him, eternal life, those were the ones who provided for those around them, provided for the needs of those around them. Another lesson that I see in this, especially from Lazarus the beggar, is we've got to avoid complaining about our condition. How easy it is to complain. Very easy. And Paul wrote to the Christians at Philippi, do all things without complaining and disputing. In other words, don't complain about your condition. Complaining shows a weak faith and a lack of contentment. And in Hebrews 13:5, the writer says, let your conduct be without covetousness. Be content with such things as you have, for he himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. We need to learn to be content, Paul said, in whatever state we're in. You know, there's no record of the beggar ever complaining, although he was in a terrible condition. And I think if he had, it had been recorded for us. But there's no complaint here. And he was a lot worse off than probably will ever be. And we need to pray for the things we need and trust the Lord to supply them. That's what we need to do. One final lesson is when we leave this earth, our destiny is fixed. I've often compared it to a book that we're writing, and we're adding to it each day. But when we depart this life, that book's going to be closed. Not going to be anything added. There's not going to be any opportunity to make changes or to correct things in our life. The rich man wanted some help, but he couldn't get it. He couldn't get it. Lazarus didn't need any help after he departed this life. He was in a place of comfort and rest. And those conditions will continue until the judgment, the resurrection and the judgment. And then that book will be opened again. And we'll be judged according to the things that we've done and the things we've said. So indeed, we can learn some lessons from these two men named Lazarus. And indeed, God was a help to them. He'll be a help to us if we trust in him and if we follow his son. Are you prepared for eternity this evening? If not, we would encourage you to make that final preparation while you still can, while the opportunity is available. We'd be glad to baptize you into Christ if you have that need. If you desire the prayers of the church, we'd be glad to pray with you and for you. If you need to respond in a public way, we bid you come while we stand and while we sing.